The salt wind howled across the concrete ramparts of Fortress Saint-Nazaire on the morning of January 17, 1945. Through the gray Atlantic mist, German Obergefreiter Klaus Weber pressed his face against the cold steel of his MG-42's sight, watching American ships multiply on the horizon like dark specks of doom. The taste of ersatz coffee, bitter chicory, and acorns lingered on his cracked lips as he counted the vessels. 12, 15, 23 destroyers and supply ships forming an iron noose around what the Reich had once proclaimed an impregnable bastion. Weber's hands trembled, not from the January cold, but from the growing realization that the concrete walls surrounding him had transformed from protective fortress into elaborate tomb. Across the fortified ports of Nazi-occupied Europe, 90,000 German soldiers found themselves trapped in what Hitler had christened Fortress Europe, a chain of coastal strongholds stretching from Norway to the Spanish border. These installations, built with slave labor and reinforced concrete thick enough to withstand direct naval bombardment, represented the pinnacle of German defensive engineering. The Atlantic Wall, as propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels proclaimed to the German people, would serve as Europe's unbreachable shield against Allied invasion. Yet by the winter of 1945, these same fortresses had become prisons, their occupants facing a choice that would have seemed inconceivable just months earlier: surrender to advancing Allied forces, or abandon their posts in direct violation of Hitler's standing orders to fight to the last man. The roots of this mass abandonment stretched back to the summer of 1944, when Allied forces had successfully established beachheads in Normandy and begun their relentless push toward the German heartland. As American, British, and Canadian armies swept across France, they deliberately bypassed many of the most heavily fortified German positions along the coast. This strategy, born from hard-learned lessons about the devastating cost of frontal assaults on prepared positions, left entire German garrisons isolated and surrounded, cut off from resupply and reinforcement. The ports of Saint-Nazaire, Lorient, La Rochelle, Royan, and the Channel Islands became islands of German resistance in an ocean of Allied. Many had believed wholeheartedly in Nazi propaganda that portrayed German soldiers as inherently superior to their enemies, destined to establish a 1,000-year Reich across Europe. The reality they now faced, isolated, undersupplied, and facing an enemy that possessed seemingly unlimited resources, shattered these fundamental beliefs about German invincibility. Wehrmacht records recovered after the war reveal the deteriorating conditions within these coastal fortresses. Food supplies, initially stockpiled to sustain garrisons for months of siege warfare, dwindled as supply submarines fell victim to increasingly effective Allied anti-submarine warfare. By December 1944, daily rations in many fortresses had been reduced to 1,200 calories per man, barely sufficient to maintain basic bodily functions, let alone combat effectiveness. Medical supplies ran critically short, forcing German doctors to perform surgeries without proper anesthesia and to watch helplessly as minor wounds became infected and gangrenous. The psychological warfare employed by Allied forces proved equally devastating to German morale. American psychological operations units established powerful radio transmitters that broadcast German-language programs directly into the fortress zones. These broadcasts, featuring German prisoners of war describing their good treatment in Allied custody, contrasted sharply with the increasingly desperate conditions within the fortresses. Allied aircraft dropped millions of leaflets over German positions, many featuring photographs of German prisoners eating hot meals and receiving medical care, alongside detailed surrender instructions and safe conduct passes. Captain Heinrich Müller of the 265th Infantry Division, stationed at Fortress La Rochelle, recorded in his diary the profound impact of these psychological operations. The Americans do not merely wage war with bombs and bullets. They wage war with abundance itself. Their leaflets arrive on paper finer than anything we have seen in months. Their prisoners, as shown in these photographs, appear better fed than our own officers. How can we maintain faith in final victory when the enemy demonstrates such overwhelming material superiority? The contrast between German expectations and American reality manifested most starkly in the realm of logistics. They expected their American opponents to suffer from the same limitations that constrained their own forces. Instead, German soldiers witnessed displays of American abundance that challenged their fundamental understanding of warfare itself. Allied supply convoys that approached the fortress zones seemed endless in their scope and variety. German observers reported American vehicles that appeared to have been discarded after minor mechanical failures, rather than repaired and returned to service as German doctrine demanded. Captured American rations revealed a level of nutritional quality and variety that many German soldiers had not experienced even during peacetime. A single American K-ration contained more calories and higher quality protein than a German soldier's daily allocation. Lieutenant Otto Brenner, serving with the 343rd Infantry Division at Saint-Nazaire, wrote to his wife in February 1945, "The Americans wage war as if they possessed the entire world's resources. Yesterday we observed their aircraft dropping supplies to their own forward positions. Many of the parachutes failed to open properly, sending valuable equipment crashing into the sea. Rather than attempt to recover these supplies, the Americans simply dispatched additional aircraft with replacement equipment. Such waste would be unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. Yet for them, it appears routine." The sound of American artillery became a constant psychological torment for German defenders. Unlike the German practice of conserving ammunition for critical moments, American gunners seemed to possess unlimited shells. The steady thunder of 155mm howitzers created a rhythm of destruction that never ceased, day or night. German soldiers reported that this constant bombardment, even when not directly targeted at their positions, created a profound sense of helplessness and doom. The message was clear. America possessed such vast resources that it could afford to expend ammunition merely to demonstrate its abundance. This overwhelming display of material superiority began to erode the ideological foundations upon which Nazi propaganda had built German morale. Nazi doctrine had taught German soldiers that democratic societies, particularly America, were inherently weak and decadent, lacking the unity and determination necessary for sustained warfare. Yet the evidence before their eyes suggested the opposite. American forces demonstrated not weakness, but an almost incomprehensible strength. Rooted not in the transformation of German military thinking accelerated as communications from the homeland painted an increasingly desperate picture. Letters from family members described cities reduced to rubble by Allied bombing, chronic food shortages, and the breakdown of basic services. Meanwhile, German soldiers in the coastal fortresses could observe American rear areas where supply depots operated around the clock, where field hospitals provided medical care that exceeded what many German cities could offer, and where American soldiers received regular mail delivery and fresh rations. Sergeant Friedrich Hoffmann of the 708th Infantry Division recorded his evolving perspective in a letter intercepted by Allied intelligence. "We were told that Americans were soft, that they lacked the will to sacrifice for victory. Yet I watched their bombers return from missions over Germany day after day, accepting losses that would cripple our own Air Force. They replaced destroyed aircraft faster than we can shoot them down. Their pilots, whom we were told lacked courage, continue to fly mission after mission. Perhaps we were mistaken about who possesses true strength." The symbol that came to represent American abundance in the minds of German defenders was the simple chocolate bar. While German rations had been reduced to sawdust-filled ersatz bread and watery soup made from turnips, Captured American supplies revealed individually wrapped chocolate bars included in every soldier's daily ration. For German soldiers who had not tasted real chocolate in months, these small brown rectangles represented everything they had lost, and everything their enemies possessed in abundance. Klaus Weber, the machine gunner at Saint-Nazaire, later recalled finding an American chocolate bar that had been dropped with propaganda leaflets. I held that piece of chocolate in my hands for 10 minutes before eating it, he remembered. It was perfectly wrapped, unmarked by war or hardship. When I tasted it, I realized that this was not merely food. This was proof that somewhere in the world factories still operated at full capacity, producing luxuries for common soldiers. We had been fighting enemies who possessed not just superior numbers, but an entirely different relationship with the material world. The decision to abandon the coastal fortresses did not come suddenly, but evolved through months of deteriorating conditions and growing. For many German soldiers, the realization dawned that they were defending fortifications that no longer served any strategic purpose. Major Wilhelm Kessel, operations officer for Fortress Lorient, documented the growing sense of futility among his men. Our orders remain unchanged. Hold these positions at all costs. Deny their use to the enemy. Fight to the last man and last bullet. Yet what purpose does our sacrifice serve when the Reich itself crumbles behind us? We are asked to die not for victory, but for the preservation of Hitler's prestige. Many of my soldiers have begun to question whether such a death carries any honor. The first large-scale abandonments began in March 1945, as German soldiers in isolated outposts simply walked away from their positions under cover of darkness. Initially, German military police attempted to maintain discipline through traditional means, courts-martial, executions, and severe punishment for desertion. However, as the scale of abandonment grew, it became clear that this was not merely individual cowardice, but a collective loss of faith in the Nazi cause. Colonel Ernst Roth, commanding the 266th Infantry Division at La Rochelle, faced a mutiny when he ordered his men to execute captured American pilots in accordance with Hitler's directive to show no mercy to terror flyers. His soldiers, many of whom had come to respect American humanitarian treatment of German prisoners, refused to carry out the order. Roth later wrote, "I realized in that moment that the war had already ended in the minds of my men. They would no longer kill for a cause they no longer believed in, against enemies they had come to respect." The transformation from Nazi ideology to pragmatic realism occurred differently for each soldier, but common threads emerged from post-war interviews and recovered documents. Many German soldiers described a moment of revelation when they realized that American forces were not the cruel invaders depicted in Nazi propaganda, but rather young men fighting for principles they genuinely believed in. The contrast between Nazi rhetoric about American barbarism and the actual behavior of American troops toward prisoners and civilians created a cognitive dissonance that many found impossible to resolve within the framework of Nazi ideology. American siege. This approach, influenced by lessons learned during the costly reduction of German fortifications in Italy, recognized that German soldiers could be induced to surrender through demonstration of overwhelming superiority rather than direct force. The siege of Fortress Saint-Nazaire exemplified this strategy. American forces established a perimeter around the port, effectively cutting off all land-based supply routes while maintaining naval blockade of the harbor. Rather than attempting to storm the fortress, American artillery methodically destroyed German supply dumps, communication facilities, and defensive positions while avoiding unnecessary casualties among their own forces. American loudspeakers broadcast surrender appeals in German, offering specific guarantees about prisoner treatment and post-war repatriation. The psychological impact of this approach proved devastating to German morale. Soldiers who had prepared for glorious last stands found themselves slowly starving, while their enemies demonstrated patience and resource abundance. The message was clear. Americans possessed such overwhelming superiority that they could afford to wait for German resistance to collapse naturally, rather than waste lives in unnecessary assaults. By April 1945, the abandonments had reached epidemic proportions. Entire companies of German soldiers surrendered en masse, often bringing their weapons and equipment with them as evidence of their intention to cooperate with Allied forces. Intelligence reports from the period describe German soldiers arriving at American lines carrying white flags made from bedsheets, medical bandages, or any available white material, desperately seeking assurance that they would receive the humanitarian treatment promised in Allied leaflets. The final collapse came with news of Hitler's death and Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945. For the remaining German defenders in the coastal fortresses, this news removed the last vestige of legal obligation to continue resistance. The surrender of Fortress Saint-Nazaire on May 11, 1945, saw nearly 8,000 German soldiers lay down their arms without firing a shot. Klaus Weber, the machine gunner who had counted American ships through the gray January mist, was among those who walked out of the fortress, carrying only his personal possessions. German soldiers, who had been taught to view Americans as racially inferior and ideologically weak, discovered instead an enemy that possessed not only superior material resources, but also superior moral authority. The chocolate bars, the endless supply convoys, the humane treatment of prisoners, and the patience to achieve victory without unnecessary bloodshed all demonstrated the strength that flows from democratic values and industrial capacity working in harmony. The transformation experienced by these 90,000 German soldiers would echo through the post-war reconstruction of Germany. Many of these men, having witnessed firsthand the contrast between Nazi promises and democratic reality, became advocates for democratic reform in their homeland. Their experience in the coastal fortresses, isolated and abandoned by their own leadership, while facing enemies who demonstrated both strength and mercy, provided a powerful counter-argument to authoritarian ideology. In the end, the crumbling of Fortress Europe's coastal bastions revealed a fundamental truth about the nature of power and legitimacy in modern warfare. Military strength alone, no matter how impressively fortified or ideologically motivated, cannot long survive when confronted with opponents who possess not only superior resources, but also superior values. The German soldiers who abandoned their posts did so not merely because they faced defeat, but because they had come to understand that they were fighting for a cause that had revealed itself to be fundamentally hollow. The concrete walls of Saint-Nazaire still stand today, weathered by decades of Atlantic storms, but largely intact. Visitors can walk through the same corridors where Klaus Weber counted enemy ships and contemplated the approaching end of his world. The machine gun positions remain, their steel fixtures rusted, but still pointing toward a sea that no longer carries threats, but rather serves as a highway for peaceful commerce between former enemies. These fortresses, built to last 1,000 years, became monuments not to German strength, but to the ultimate futility of systems built on coercion rather than consent. They remind us that true security lies not in walls of concrete and steel, but in the values that unite free peoples in common cause. The 90,000 German soldiers who chose surrender over senseless sacrifice discovered what their leaders had failed to understand. In the gentle sound of waves breaking against those ancient ramparts, we can still hear the echo of chocolate wrappers rustling in trembling hands. and the whispered conversations of young men, choosing life over ideology, choosing hope over hatred, choosing the uncertain promise of democratic tomorrow over the certain doom of authoritarian yesterday. The fortresses they abandoned stand as monuments to that choice, and to the enduring truth that freedom's greatest victory lies not in conquest, but in conversion. The moment when enemies become friends, and walls built for war become windows opened to peace.